In Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, a king who should be racing home seems to fear the shore waiting for him. Behind him lies Troy. Ahead lies Ithaca. Between them, an age of palaces is beginning to crack. Tonight, in a story made to help you sleep, we will enter that uncertain sea. Did Odysseus return through the collapse of his own civilization? Were the Greeks who destroyed Troy remembered elsewhere as the sea peoples? What law of Zeus could bind a stranger when ports and promises were failing? And if home was the prize, why might victory make returning harder than war? Picture a dark-hulled ship rising and falling beyond an island harbor. Bronze catches a little moonlight beneath folded cloth. Oars rest along the rails. The men aboard have crossed a world of unfamiliar coasts, but the most difficult threshold may be the familiar doorway ahead. A returning king must learn who kept faith, who took his place, and whether the old rules still mean what they meant when he sailed. Across the same broad sea, messages are moving faster than certainty. A ruler at Ugarit writes that enemy ships have appeared while his own forces are away. Egyptian walls will preserve strange group names beneath images of invasion and defeat. Palace tablets count rowers, grain, armor, animals, and offerings, as though a kingdom can hold disorder back by giving every obligation a line. You may watch those clues gather, or let the oars and names drift past. The questions will keep sailing without you. I'm Elias, guiding your imagination through hidden history. In the comments, leave your next journey idea and one improvement. Upvote favorites. These episodes take many hours of research and editing. A like or subscription supports this small channel. If chosen, I'll credit your name. Now, step inside. The ship in our imagination moves closer to shore. No herald comes out to meet it. The returning men cannot yet see which doors are barred, which storehouses are full, or whose seal now closes the rooms they once knew. Every mile behind them has enlarged the story told about Troy. Every quiet building ahead may contain a different account of what their victory cost. One night on this journey will take us into a palace where clay tablets still carry the pressure of rowers, grain, bronze, and watch posts. Another will bring us beneath Egyptian inscriptions where the names called sea peoples refuse to settle into one simple identity. We will stand at a stranger's threshold and ask why hospitality could be more than good manners. We will return to Ithaca beside a man who survives by disguising himself, then discover why recognition can be as dangerous as concealment. Some clues will appear to fit Nolan's world almost perfectly. Others will pull the film, the poem, and the Bronze Age apart, just when they seem ready to become one story. We will not choose between wonder and evidence. We will let the wonder carry us far enough that the evidence has somewhere meaningful to land. For now, keep the coastline indistinct. Somewhere beyond it, a palace record is drying in clay. Somewhere else, a lookout is watching a sail whose allegiance cannot yet be known. At one doorway, a stranger is waiting to learn whether he will be welcomed, questioned, or turned away. And on the dark water between those worlds, Odysseus is still facing home. Only when the ship has entered the harbor will we place three maps beside one another: the world Nolan created, the poem Homer gives us, and the fragmentary world recovered from ruins, tablets, and inscriptions. Their coastlines sometimes touch. They are never the same map. The pleasure of this journey lies in discovering exactly where they meet and where the sea opens between them again. In Nolan's film, Odysseus returns through a world shaped by guilt, political fracture, and the approach of collapse. The film connects Greek warriors with the disputed sea peoples. It gives Athena the appearance of a murdered Trojan girl, as though divine guidance and remembered violence have occupied the same face. It makes Odysseus reluctant to come home, and after the reckoning on Ithaca, it sends him away again while Telemachus rules. Those are the film's choices. They are meaningful choices, and they form the questions of this journey, but they are not all choices made by Homer. In the received Odyssey, Odysseus repeatedly declares that he wants to return. He's delayed by Poseidon's hostility, by Calypso, by Circe, by dangers on the route, by his companions, and by his own pride, curiosity, concealment, and mistakes. Athena is not the ghost of a Trojan girl. She is an acting goddess who argues for Odysseus, guides Telemachus, arranges disguises, helps recognitions unfold, supports the struggle in the hall, and finally helps stop the feud. The poem's ending is different as well. Odysseus does not surrender Ithaca to Telemachus and sail west with Penelope. He remains, and Zeus and Athena impose a settlement that ends the immediate cycle of revenge. Whatever we make of the poem's moral tensions, its declared destination is Nostos, the return home. Then there is the third Odyssey, not a story at all, but a field of surviving evidence. It consists of ruined walls, storage rooms, weapons, pottery, administrative tablets, shipwreck cargoes, divine names, later offerings, and layers of settlement. These things can reveal how palaces counted resources, how goods traveled, how warfare was organized, and how communities changed. They cannot reveal a private conversation in Odysseus's mind. The time between these layers matters. The Mycenaean palaces flourished during the later 2nd millennium BCE and failed or changed around the end of the Bronze Age. The Odyssey took shape in a long oral tradition, with its conventional formation placed centuries later, around the late 8th or early 7th century BCE. It then passed through writing, ancient scholarship, papyri, and manuscripts. Its world can contain old echoes, later customs, and poetic invention in the same scene. So we will use a simple set of phrases. In Nolan's film tells us what the adaptation proposes. In Homer's poem tells us what the literary tradition makes happen. In the surviving evidence tells us what archaeology, inscriptions, and historically bounded inference can support. When a question cannot cross from one column to another, that stopping point is not a failure. It is part of the answer. Consider how quickly the layers could otherwise blur. A film image of Athena may feel ancient because the goddess's name is ancient. A Homeric scene may feel Bronze Age because it stands near a ruined palace. An Egyptian inscription may seem to name the film's raiders because a modern historian placed several groups under one familiar heading. In each case, resemblance begins a comparison. It does not complete one. Dates, source purpose, and the kind of claim being made still decide what can safely cross. With that method settled, we can approach the world that existed before the palaces fell. Not the palace of Odysseus, which has not been found, but the real Mycenaean systems that made a palace king imaginable. A Mycenaean palace was more than a large residence on the hill. At places such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, it stood within a network of storerooms, workshops, fields, roads, shrines, officials, craftspeople, and communities whose relationship with central authority varied from place to place. Thick walls and prominent halls made power visible. Clay tablets made selected parts of that power countable. Those tablets were written in Linear B, an early form of Greek. They were not histories composed for distant readers. They were working records, allocations, people, animals, land, textiles, offerings, and goods moving through an administrative system. Many survived because destruction baked clay that had never been intended to last. At Pylos, one tablet lists 30 rowers assigned to go to a place read as Pleiron. Another preserves a count of 569 rowers and may originally have recorded about 600. The numbers are striking, but their meaning is narrower than a fleet scene. They show that an authority could count and mobilize maritime labor at scale. They do not tell us which vessel each man boarded, why the larger group was called, or whether the occasion was routine service, war, defense, evacuation, or something else. That silence matters because palace economy is easy to exaggerate. The palace could collect, assign, store, redistribute, and command in important sectors, yet it did not necessarily own every exchange, direct every workshop, or supervise every vessel. Local households, regional communities, merchants, craftspeople, and elites also acted. Central control was powerful, but selective. The same world reached outward. Mycenaean goods circulated widely, and Eastern Mediterranean networks moved copper, tin, pottery, glass, resin, textiles, foodstuffs, luxury objects, and diplomatic gifts across long distances. A contemporary letter from the ruler of Elias to the Egyptian king discusses a shipment of copper. Such evidence reveals rulers' quantities, obligations, and exchange. It does not identify the owner of every cargo or the route of every ship. This combination of central counting and distant dependence created strength. A palace could gather labor, support specialists, maintain stores, and turn agricultural surplus into political action. Yet connections also created exposure. If routes became unreliable, if rival elites fought, if harvests tightened, if labor moved, or if violence interrupted several links at once, a central system could lose more than one function together. Storage itself reveals both power and limitation. A storeroom can gather oil, grain, vessels, tools, or raw material so that work continues beyond one household's immediate supply. A workshop can concentrate skill. A tablet can coordinate an allocation. But stored goods must be replenished, buildings maintained, specialists supported, and instructions understood. Centralization reduces some uncertainties while making continued coordination important. This is a systems observation, not a claim that one missing delivery brought down a palace. The tablets also remind us how accidental the archive is. Most clay records are temporary. They survive in unusual numbers where destruction fired them hard enough for archaeologists to recover. A place without a preserved tablet may still have counted, promised, owed, and remembered. A place with tablets shows only what administrators chose to record in the short interval that happened to survive. The archive is a narrow window, not a complete picture of Mycenaean society. That does not mean a single broken root toppled a kingdom. It means the palace world was a system rather than a solitary building. When archaeologists speak of palatial collapse, they are describing the failure of administrative forms, elite centers, and connected arrangements that had organized many tasks. The people who once performed those tasks did not simply vanish when the record stopped. Nolan's returning king expects a kingdom. Homer imagines a royal household contested by suitors. History can show us real palace systems and their limits, but it cannot place Odysseus at the head of one. The next question therefore moves from the palace to the armed men it could gather. Were they heroes, raiders, or both depending on the shore? The word hero belongs to a community's memory. The word raider may belong to the people who saw the same vessel approaching. Mycenaean societies possessed weapons, fortifications, warrior imagery, chariots, and administrative capacity. Their elites celebrated martial identity, and their institutions could organize at least some bodies of fighting men. None of this is surprising in the palace world. Nor does it mean every Mycenaean man was a warrior, or every voyage a raid. Homeric poetry is unusually candid about the uncertainty. In Book 9 of the Odyssey, Odysseus describes reaching Ismarus, sacking the town, killing men, and taking wealth and captives. The episode does not present every voyage as peaceful exchange. It also does not give us a documentary report from the 13th century BCE. It tells us that the later epic tradition could place raiding comfortably inside a hero's account of himself. From Odysseus' perspective, the raid is one event in a difficult return. From the perspective of the attacked community, the same men would not look like weary travelers searching for home. This shift of viewpoint helps explain Nolan's question without proving Nolan's answer. Victorious warriors can occupy more than one moral category. A poem may celebrate skill and endurance while also revealing appetite, violence, and failed restraint. Archaeology allows a cautious historical bridge. After the Palatial period, people with maritime knowledge and fighting experience could have joined movements of raiders, mercenaries, migrants, displaced households, or new communities. Ships and coastal routes made movement possible. Political disruption made old affiliations less dependable. But the evidence does not provide a single roster, a universal Greek reputation, or a line from one Trojan army into one named Egyptian group. Trade and raiding could also use some of the same practical knowledge. A coast learned through exchange can later be approached in conflict. A ship, a crew familiar with seasonal conditions and relationships in several ports may support commerce at one moment and coercion at another. That overlap is historically plausible, but it does not let us identify the purpose of an excavated cargo or assign piracy to every sailor. Capacity is not the same as a recorded act. Even the richest shipwreck evidence must be handled carefully. Wuriburun, for example, reveals extraordinary exchange and maritime work around 1320 BCE, but its excavators interpret it as an Eastern Mediterranean merchant vessel, probably with a Syro-Canaanite crew and some mainland Greek passengers. It is not a Greek warship and not an Odyssean ship. It demonstrates mobility and connection, not the identity of Nolan's raiders. The maximum safe answer is therefore modest. Mycenaean societies could organize warfare. Maritime raiding was plausible and almost certainly real in some contexts. Homer preserves raiding as part of heroic storytelling. Yet the evidence does not support the claim that all Greeks were pirates, that every neighboring people feared one Greek raider nation, or that returning heroes can be assigned collectively to the sea peoples. This makes the stranger and the shore difficult to classify. He might be a trader, messenger, mercenary, migrant, guest, or threat. Before a passport or international court, how did a story imagine the first fragile steps from stranger to protected visitor? That question leads to the phrase Nolan calls Zeus's law. In Nolan's film, Zeus's law becomes a broad moral rule, a way of naming the order that should govern strangers, households, kings, and the consequences of violence. In Homer's poem, the closest and more precise idea is xenia, the reciprocal relationship between guest and host under the protection of Zeus. Xenios, Zeus as guardian of strangers. Xenia is not merely politeness. A stranger arrives without the protections of home. A good host offers safety, a place to sit, food, and an opportunity to speak. The guest accepts welcome without seizing the household. Gifts and safe departure can extend the relationship beyond one night, creating obligations that may link families across distance and time. The poem tests this pattern again and again. The Cyclops rejects the authority of Zeus over strangers and turns hospitality inside out. The suitors remain in Odysseus' house, consume its stores, pressure Penelope, and abuse the relationship they should respect. Other hosts receive travelers with care. Odysseus himself is not a perfect guardian of restraint, which is why xenia works as a test rather than a claim that Greeks always behaved well. The idea also helps explain the practical value of recognition in a mobile world. Travel places people beyond familiar kin and local authority. Exchange, diplomacy, pilgrimage, marriage, and seafaring all become easier when a stranger can enter a known relationship of protection and reciprocity. The archaeological evidence shows movement and long networks. It does not show that every transaction followed Homeric xenia, but it helps us understand why later poetry made the threshold so important. Reciprocity means that the relationship extends beyond generosity in the moment. The host who protects a traveler may later travel under the protection of another household. A gift can remember an obligation after the meal is finished. A name, lineage, or token can make a distant connection intelligible. Homeric poetry heightens these patterns for narrative effect, and later Greek practice was never uniform. But the underlying problem is plain. Movement requires ways to turn an unknown arrival into a socially legible person. Here the historical boundary must stay close. No surviving Mycenaean tablet is headed Zeus's law. Linear B records can name gods and offerings, but they do not preserve this poetic institution as a written Bronze Age legal code. Xenia is strong evidence for Homeric narrative and for later Greek social thought. Its older roots may be discussed cautiously, but unchanged continuity cannot be assumed. Nor did one violation of hospitality cause the Bronze Age collapse. Greek tradition treats Paris's abuse of Menelaus's welcome as a moral beginning to the Trojan conflict, and the film can use broken trust as a symbol for a world coming apart. Archaeology cannot turn that moral structure into regional causation, so the safe answer is clear. Zeus's law is the film's compressed name for Homeric Xenia, a sacred, reciprocal duty between guest and host. It was a framework for imagining trust, vulnerability, and social order, not a recovered Mycenaean statute. And its most famous broken threshold points us toward Troy, where a real place and an epic story meet without becoming identical. Troy was real. At Izirlik, in modern Turkey, archaeologists have uncovered a deeply layered settlement occupied and rebuilt across thousands of years. Its late Bronze Age city had substantial fortifications and a lower town. Different archaeological levels preserve damage, destruction, abandonment, rebuilding, and change. That is already a remarkable historical answer. It tells us that the name Troy is not attached to an imaginary point floating outside geography. A significant Bronze Age community stood there, connected to the wider Aegean and Anatolian world, and it experienced conflict or destruction more than once. An archaeological layer is assembled slowly. Walls cut through earlier walls. Floors are resurfaced. Pottery changes. Rubble fills rooms. A burn deposit may preserve the end of one building without explaining the fate of an entire population. Later inhabitants rebuild above what came before. This patient sequence is why Izirlik can be securely called a real ancient city, while the cause and story attached to any one damaged level remain open to debate. Yet a real city does not prove every part of the story told about it. Archaeology has not recovered a label saying that one destruction was the 10-year war of the Iliad. It has not identified Agamemnon, Achilles, Hector, Helen, Paris, or Odysseus in a contemporary record at the site. It has not discovered evidence that demonstrates the wooden horse. There may have been conflicts around Troy, and historical struggle behind parts of the tradition is plausible. The site occupied a position worth controlling and lived within a politically active region. But plausible conflict is not the same as a verified coalition, duration, caste, motive, and ending. Several memories and events could have gathered around one famous place during centuries of storytelling. The distinction also protects the collapse question. A destruction layer shows that a place was damaged. It does not identify the attacker, explain the cause, or prove that this one event brought down palaces across the eastern Mediterranean. Fire at Troy cannot carry the weight of every later failure. Nolan's film begins its moral wound at Troy. Homer's epic tradition makes Troy the great field from which many difficult returns begin. The surviving evidence gives us a real, layered city and the possibility of war, but not the exact war that either story requires. We can now widen the map again. Troy may hold one destruction among many, but the end of the Bronze Age was not a row of identical cities falling to one advancing hand. It was a set of connected failures, survivals, movements, and local choices. The phrase Bronze Age collapse is useful because something profound did happen. It is dangerous because it sounds like a single event. Across the eastern Mediterranean, near the end of the second millennium BCE, several political and administrative systems failed. Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed or abandoned and did not resume their old Linear B administration. The Hittite imperial structure disappeared. Ugarit was destroyed. Some long-distance exchange patterns contracted or changed. Egypt fought groups arriving by land and sea and survived, though the world around it was being rearranged. The dates do not form one clean line. One region's destruction may precede another's. Some places show violence, some abandonment, some reduced settlement, some continuity, and some recovery in new forms. Even within the Aegean, the end of a palace does not mean the end of every nearby community. Nor does every damaged building preserve the same event. Fire can follow attack, accident, abandonment, or later reuse. Objects may be left because departure was hurried, because a room was already disused, or because later occupants changed the space. Fortification can express real insecurity without identifying the enemy it was meant to resist. Archaeologists therefore compare the destruction layer with settlement history, regional chronology, texts, environmental evidence, and what happens next. A dramatic deposit is one part of an explanation, not an explanation by itself. This is why current historical explanation tends towards several interacting pressures. Political systems may have contained rivalries and brutal concentrations of authority. Warfare and raiding could destroy centers, interrupt routes, or redirect labor. Drought and other environmental stress may have reduced margins in some areas or periods. Earthquakes could damage particular places. Trade disruption could withhold materials or income. Migration could be cause, consequence, or both. The order of events can change the explanation. Environmental stress before political conflict may narrow choices and intensify rivalry. Conflict before migration may send people toward regions already under pressure. A damaged port may weaken inland authorities that depended on its connections, while a failing inland center may stop supporting the port. Because the chronology differs from place to place, historians test local sequences before borrowing a regional story. A factor important at one site may be secondary at another. None of these terms is a master key. Drought does not burn every building. An earthquake does not explain every political change. Raiders do not account for every abandoned settlement. A failed palace can weaken exchange, but a broken exchange network can also weaken a palace. Causes can feed consequences that become new causes. Imagine, without pretending to replay one documented event, a system that depends on many ordinary links. Administrators collect and allocate goods. Farmers and herders produce them. Craftspeople require materials. Soldiers and rowers require support. Elite relationships move gifts and obligations across distance. Ships and caravans carry copper, tin, pottery, food, and messages. Remove one link, and the rest may adjust. Weaken several at once, and adjustment becomes more difficult. The Ilubarun cargo, a century or more before the terminal palace destructions, offers a scale of connectivity rather than a collapse scene. Copper, tin, glass, resin, containers, and luxury goods had been gathered from a broad exchange field. A contemporary letter about copper from Alicia to Egypt shows political communication around such shipments. Neither source tells us that one missing cargo caused a palace to fall. Together, they show why distant relationships mattered. The same restraint applies to food and climate. Environmental strain can tighten choices without permitting us to invent one starving household, one failed harvest, or one desperate departure. Archaeological patterns work at different scales from private experience. The responsible story is about reduced options and compounded pressure, not an undocumented catastrophe assigned to a named night. Egypt offers another useful limit. Its royal sources describe major threats and celebrate victory, yet the Egyptian state survived. Survival did not mean that nothing changed, just as destruction elsewhere did not mean that all life ended. The comparison warns against treating the map as a row of identical outcomes. One polity could absorb, redirect, or commemorate pressure that another could not manage in the same way. Nor should the word system make people disappear. Institutions are patterns of repeated human action. A palace functions because farmers deliver, scribes record, craftspeople make, carriers move, officials decide, and communities accept or resist claims on them. When that pattern weakens, people do not become abstract pieces. They seek other patrons, work at another scale, move, stay, improvise, or preserve only part of an older routine. Archaeology can often see the changed pattern more clearly than any one decision. What actually collapsed then? In many places, palace administration, imperial authority, elite centers, writing practices, and portions of long exchange failed or transformed. What did not simply disappear? People, skills, local production, memory, movement, and every form of settlement. This answer releases the first large question. Odysseus, if treated as a literary figure returning through this horizon, could be imagined coming home to a changed system. But history cannot say that he did. Nor has the collapse yet told us who the sea peoples were. It has only shown why one neat culprit is unlikely to explain such varied results. The Egyptian records now come into view. They are indispensable, vivid, and shaped by royal power. To use them well, we must read the names they preserve without letting a modern umbrella become an ancient nation. The ancient Egyptians did not leave us a document titled The Sea Peoples. That familiar phrase is a modern umbrella placed over several groups named separately in Egyptian inscriptions and images. The sources describe enemies, battles, movement, and royal victory. They are among the most important evidence we have, and they are also monuments to the authority of the pharaoh. The Great Harris Papyrus, for example, belongs to the record of Ramses III's reign and celebrates royal success. Temple reliefs and inscriptions organize disorder into an image of enemies defeated by the king. This does not make the conflicts imaginary. It means the source is not a neutral census, migration survey, or ethnographic interview. Royal presentation shapes more than tone. It can compress separate movements into one victory, emphasize the pharaoh's control, and arrange unfamiliar people into recognizable enemy types. The names remain precious evidence because without them the historical question would be poorer. Yet their placement inside a victory account means they must be compared with archaeology beyond Egypt. The safest reading holds two ideas together. The texts refer to real conflict and real groups, and the form in which they reach us was designed to honor royal power. The separately named groups have inspired many proposed identifications. Scholars compare names, clothing, weapons, pottery, settlement changes, routes, and chronology. Some comparisons suggest connections with the Aegean for some people. Others point elsewhere. A name that sounds familiar in a later language is not by itself a passport. Material culture requires the same caution. A locally made pot can imitate an imported form. A migrant can continue one practice and adopt another. A weapon style can move through trade, service, capture, or prestige. Households can be mixed, and children can grow up with affiliations different from those of their parents. Archaeology may reveal movement and contact without reducing every object to an ethnic label. The human reality may have been mixed. Some groups could include raiders seeking wealth, mercenaries changing employers, fighters attached to households, migrants escaping disrupted regions, families searching for land, or communities forming new alliances. These categories need not exclude one another. A person may move as a fighter and a displaced member of a household at the same time. One peer-reviewed model emphasizes coalitions of mobile warrior groups comparable in some respects to pirates or mercenaries. Other scholarship stresses migration, settlement, and the long interaction between local and incoming populations. Each model explains part of the evidence. None turns all the named groups into one people with one origin. Even the word coalition should remain conditional. Egyptian texts arrange named enemies within a royal story, but they do not provide a constitution for a permanent alliance. Groups may have cooperated for one movement or conflict, separated later, absorbed other people, or changed names and leadership. The umbrella is useful for discussing a shared documentary problem. It becomes misleading when it suggests that everyone beneath it understood themselves as one nation. This is where Nolan makes a dramatic compression. The film allows Odysseus and his returning warriors to fear that they are the sea people others have been warned about. The idea joins victory, guilt, wandering, and collapse in one image. It is a powerful film answer. It is not a line from Homer, and it is not an identification demonstrated by archaeology. Homer knows raiders. Homer knows troubled returns, displaced men, strangers, mercenary-like service, and ships whose arrival may be welcomed or feared. The poem does not know the modern collective term sea peoples, and it does not connect Odysseus's crew to Egyptian ethnonyms. History permits a narrower statement. Some people involved in the movements of the period may have come from the Aegean. Some may have known Mycenaean warfare or seafaring. Material traditions can travel with people through trade, through imitation, or through mixed communities. So even an Aegean-looking object cannot settle ethnicity by itself. History does not permit the sentence that the Greeks were the sea peoples. It does not permit the sentence that Odysseus and his veterans became the sea peoples. And it does not permit the sentence that the sea peoples caused the entire Bronze Age collapse. Raiding, warfare, migration, and resettlement belong to the crisis. Their importance varied by region. They interacted with political fragility, disrupted exchange, environmental pressure, local conflict, and the consequences of earlier failures. Egypt survived the attacks it commemorated. Other systems failed in different sequences. The varied map remains the better guide. The central answer can now be stated without strain. The sea peoples were not one securely identified Greek nation. They are a modern collective label for several disputed groups recorded chiefly through Egyptian royal sources. Some Aegean connections are plausible. A complete Greek identity is unproved. Their movements participated in a multi-causal transformation. They are not a sufficient single cause. The film's reveal, therefore, works as a thematic question rather than a recovered historical secret. It asks whether heroes can become someone else's raiders and whether victory can carry disorder home. History answers that such reversals are possible in human societies. It does not place one mythic crew inside the evidence. With the largest causal question settled, we can let the map grow quieter. Instead of searching for Odysseus among armies and migrations, we can narrow the view to one island and ask what archaeology finds there. Ithaca is real. The Ionian island exists beneath the later story, with its coves, slopes, settlements, and long human history. Archaeological work has found material from the Bronze Age and later periods. Excavations around Stavros and elsewhere show that people lived on the island in antiquity. That answers the geographic question. It does not yet answer the biographical one. Later finds also show that people on Ithaca associated their island with Odysseus. Offerings and inscriptions belong to a history of hero cult, memory, and local identity. That belief is itself a historical fact. At a later date, real people honored a figure called Odysseus and connected him with the island. Hero cult occupies a different kind of historical ground from biography. A community may honor a hero because a story is old, because a place claims the story, because worship strengthens identity, or because generations have made the association meaningful. The sanctuary, offering, or inscription tells us about those worshippers and their relationship with the past. It does not supply a birth date, reign, campaign, or death for the person in the poem. But later honor cannot move backward in time and become a contemporary palace record. A dedication proves devotion or commemoration by the people who made it. It does not prove that the epic king lived in the Bronze Age. Claims that Odysseus's palace has been found remain disputed. No excavated building is universally accepted as his house. No contemporary linear B tablet names the epic Odysseus as ruler of Ithaca. No securely identified tomb supplies his body and biography. The landscape can resemble poetic descriptions in suggestive ways, but a poem's geography is shaped by performance and story as well as place. This does not require us to imagine that the character emerged from nothing. Oral traditions can gather traits from social types, remembered names, local cults, old stories, and many generations of performance. A palace leader, ship captain, raider, traveler, household ruler, and cunning folktale hero may all contribute to what the name Odysseus became. No method now available can isolate one prototype and recover his life. The maximum safe wording is simple. Ithaca is a real island with ancient occupation. Later islanders honored Odysseus. Archaeology has not identified his palace, and no contemporary evidence identifies the poem's king as a historical individual. Nolan's Ithaca remains important as the place his character both seeks and leaves. Homer's Ithaca is the desired home, the contested household, and the setting where identity is finally disclosed. Historical Ithaca gives the traditions a real landscape and a later community of remembrance. These three truths can stand together without turning the last two into a passport for the first. Once the person remains unverified, his private psychology must remain unverified as well. We can interpret Nolan's character. We can read Homer's delays. We cannot diagnose a Bronze Age king. That boundary leads naturally to Athena, the quieter gods of the film, and the difficult desire to return. Nolan's film gives much of the poem's divine machinery to psychology, weather, memory, and consequence. Zeus and Poseidon are largely quieter as visible agents. Athena remains, but in an altered form, the image of a murdered Trojan girl associated with Odysseus's guilt. That Athena is a film invention. In Homer's Odyssey, Athena is not a dead Trojan girl and not merely a private symptom. She acts beyond Odysseus's sight. She speaks among the gods, guides Telemachus, disguises Odysseus, assists recognition, supports the action against the suitors, and helps impose peace. Poseidon's anger is a central cause of wandering. Zeus weighs and orders events. At the level of the poem, these gods are agents. A modern reader may interpret what they mean, but the narrative does not reduce them to weather or thoughts. Nolan's film chooses a different causal world, one in which a divine figure can also carry the face of remembered violence. Bronze Age evidence supplies a narrower connection. Linear B tablets record offerings and names corresponding to several later Greek gods, including Zeus and Poseidon. This demonstrates that some familiar divine names and cult practices existed in Mycenaean administration. The tablets are accounts, not preserved hymns, theology, or epic scenes. Shared names do not prove unchanged personalities or stories. The tablet may record an offering, a quantity, a sanctuary, or a divine recipient because an administrator needed the transaction remembered. It normally does not tell us what a worshipper believed the god looked like, which myth was told at a festival, or how divine action was understood in private life. Continuity of a name is important evidence. It is also a narrow bridge, and the missing stories on either side should not be filled by the film. History also cannot decide whether a cinematic vision is a goddess, guilt, memory, or all three inside the film's design. That is an interpretive question. It is not the kind of claim archaeology can test. The same limit applies to trauma. Nolan gives Odysseus guilt, avoidance, and a sense that returning home requires him to face what he did at Troy. Trauma and moral injury are useful languages for discussing that characterization. They may also illuminate patterns in ancient stories about veterans and difficult returns. But a literary pattern is not a clinical diagnosis. Odysseus is not an examinable patient, and there is no documented Bronze Age biography whose symptoms can be assessed. We should not say that the historical Odysseus had post-traumatic stress disorder because history has not first established that individual. Homer's answer to the homecoming question is different from Nolan's. The poem repeatedly says that Odysseus desires home. His return is prolonged by divine hostility, enchantment, monsters, companions' actions, and his own failures of judgment or restraint. Readers can still find ambivalence in him, but the poem's organizing desire is nostos. And the ending matters. In the received Book 24, Odysseus remains on Ithaca. Zeus and Athena stop the next round of revenge. Nolan turns that settlement into a new departure, allowing Penelope and Odysseus to leave while Telemachus rules. The film's exile completes its guilt story. It is not Homer's ending and not a recovered historical event. So why does the film's victorious king hesitate to go home? Because Nolan makes homecoming a moral reckoning and gives avoidance a psychological cause. Why is Homer delayed? Because the poem joins divine conflict, human choice, danger, disguise, and desire in a different causal pattern. What does history say? It can describe returning warrior dislocation as a possible social problem, but it cannot diagnose Odysseus or record his reluctance. The heroic questions are now nearly at rest. Beyond them lies the slower history of people who continued after the palace systems ended. When a palace archive ends, it is tempting to let the screen go dark. The clay tablets stop, the great administrative center is damaged, and the historian loses a particular kind of voice. Yet silence in one archive is not silence in every home. After the Mycenaean palaces failed, communities continued across the Aegean. Settlement patterns changed. Some places were abandoned, some reduced, some moved, and some persisted. Production often operated at a different scale. Pottery styles changed and traveled. Metalworking, farming, herding, building, fishing, seafaring, burial, worship, and exchange did not cease everywhere at once. The loss was still real. A person who had worked within the palace system could no longer depend on the same offices, stores, written allocations, elite patrons, or routes of authority. Specialist production might contract or relocate. Long-distance goods could become less available or move through different hands. Political identities could change. These are consequences without requiring us to invent one family's hunger or one worker's private grief. The disappearance of Linear B from the surviving record is especially easy to mistake for a disappearance of knowledge. Writing had served a particular administrative system. When that system ended, the incentive and institutional setting for those short clay records ended with it. People still knew seasons, fields, animals, tools, kin, coastlines, songs, and obligations without preserving them in the form an archaeologist can later read. The archive becomes quieter partly because the kind of archive has changed. Mobility was part of this world. People could move because of danger, opportunity, alliance, marriage, service, land, or the loss of an old center. Some mobile groups may have included experienced fighters. Some may have carried Aegean practices into new regions. Archaeology can sometimes trace changes in objects, foodways, buildings, or burial, but those patterns rarely provide a complete account of who moved, why, and what they called themselves. That is why returning veterans remain a possibility rather than a solution. Epic traditions remember difficult homecomings after Troy. A disrupted historical world could certainly contain armed men returning to changed communities. No surviving evidence lets us track one Trojan army home, measure its trauma, or show that its veterans destabilized the palaces as a group. Maritime life changed as well. Ship imagery and regional traditions across the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age do not form one unbroken type. Contact and borrowing continued, but vessels, routes, and social uses evolved. The old vessel research helps here only as evidence of change and connectivity. Water jars, anchor loads, and loading order no longer need to lead the story. The quieter answer is adaptation. Palace administrations disappeared, but people carried skills into smaller or different settings. They made pots, tended animals, repaired tools, navigated local waters, remembered places, honored gods, and told stories. Some practices were lost. Others changed. Some were reinvented and later presented as ancient. This is the beginning of the sleep descent. The film's collapsing horizon can now soften into many local mornings after the old offices had closed. No single person knew that a period called the Bronze Age had ended. People knew only that a route, ruler, storehouse, neighbor, or obligation was no longer what it had been, and that ordinary work still waited. A household might repair a wall with material at hand, reuse an older vessel, work a smaller field, or exchange with a nearer community. These are representative possibilities, not scenes recovered from one named family. They show why continuity does not mean stability, and why change does not require emptiness. The historical picture becomes less monumental but not less human. From those changed communities, stories continued to move. They carried names such as Troy, Mycenaean, Ithaca, Zeus, Athena, and Odysseus across centuries in which the palace tablets could no longer be read. The next question is not whether memory stayed pure. It is how repeated poetry could make a lost age feel present while continually remaking it. The Odyssey feels old because it is old. It is simply not as old in its surviving poetic form as the palace world it sometimes seems to remember. Scholars conventionally place the formation of the Iliad and Odyssey around the late 8th or early 7th century BCE after a long background of oral performance. That is centuries after the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces. The poems were shaped in a world that had inherited names, places, formulas, objects, ruins, rituals, and stories from many earlier generations. Oral tradition does not work like an untouched container sealed in 1200 BCE. Performers learn patterns, phrases, scenes, and story structures. They preserve what remains meaningful, alter what no longer fits, combine versions, and create within inherited forms. Continuity and transformation occur together. Repeated formulas can help a performer shape long narrative in performance, while familiar scenes give listeners points of recognition. A council, feast, arming, voyage, welcome, or return can be renewed for another audience without being recited as a fixed archival transcript. The very techniques that preserve a tradition also allow it to remain usable. Age can survive through change rather than in spite of it. This helps explain the poem's mixed material world. A scene may contain an old place name beside a later social practice. A weapon, burial custom, ship, palace, or political relationship may fit one period better than another. The poem can remember the Age of Bronze while speaking through the experience of later communities. Testing a possible old echo therefore begins with a narrow question. Does the object, institution, word, or place have an independent Bronze Age parallel? Does the poetic detail fit that parallel closely or only at a broad level? Is there counter-evidence from the poet's own era? Could the resemblance arise because the problem itself is common across centuries? This method works better than declaring the whole poem ancient or late. It allows one detail to preserve depth while another reflects the world of performance. Shipbuilding offers one restrained example. Ulu-born surviving cedar planks were joined with robust, pegged mortise and tenon joints. Homer's Book 5 describes Odysseus constructing a vessel, but specialist argument has connected some of its language more closely with laced construction, known from later practice. The comparison does not make the poem false. It shows why a poetic scene cannot be treated as a technical manual from the 14th century BCE. The same care applies to stars and provisions. The poem names constellations for navigation and places wine in jars and meal in sewn skins. These details tell us what the later epic imagined as intelligible travel. Celestial knowledge and provisioning are surely older than the poem, but the exact Homeric list and sequence cannot be assigned unchanged to one Bronze Age voyage. Writing introduced another stage, not a perfect frieze. A written form is generally presumed by the Archaic period, while the earliest surviving papyri are later. Ancient editors, variant copies, and manuscript traditions participated in the text that reached modern readers. There is no surviving first manuscript against which every line can be checked. Variants do not make the poem unknowable. They reveal the transmission has a history. Scholars compare wording, manuscripts, papyri, quotations, language, meter, and the work of ancient editors. The received text is stable enough to support close reading, yet its stability was achieved through time. This is a more precise answer than imagining either perfect preservation or complete invention. This is why the question of one man named Homer remains open. Homer is the traditional authorial name. The poems may reflect powerful acts of composition and organization, but a secure biography and one recoverable origine text are not available. The history of the poem is a history of performance, writing, stabilization, copying, and reading. Monster questions belong at the same boundary. Real whirlpools, straits, animals, plants, fossils, unfamiliar peoples, and inherited folk tales may have contributed to later attempts to locate Cyclops, Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, or the Lotus. No proposed analog proves one unique origin. The monsters perform poetic work, testing restraint, knowledge, identity, and leadership. Turning each into one solved place or organism would replace the poem's complexity with unsupported certainty. So how much Bronze Age history did Homer preserve? Some names, places, objects, institutions, and story materials may carry old echoes. Other details belong to later practice. Many cannot be dated securely. Each motif must be tested separately. The Odyssey is neither a transparent Bronze Age archive nor a work with no relationship to the older world. It is a later poem built near real ruins, within communities that had inherited a distant past and made it speak again. Nolan, in turn, takes that received poem and rebuilds it for another age, giving modern form to guilt, collapse, and the suspicion that the hero may also be the danger. The three Odysseys can now rest beside one another. Nolan's film imagines a victorious man who fears that his violence belongs to a world coming apart. It makes the sea peoples a mirror for Greek warriors, gives Athena the face of remembered guilt, and turns homecoming into another departure. Homer's poem gives us a different order. Odysseus longs for Nostos, though gods, companions, dangers, and his own choices delay him. Xenia measures hosts and strangers. Athena acts. Zeus and Poseidon act. Ithaca remains the place where identity and rule are contested, and where the received poem finally imposes peace. The surviving history gives us a real Troy, an ancient Ithaca, Mycenaean palaces, organized warfare, raiding, wide exchange, divine names, destruction, migration, survival, and change. It does not give us a proven Odysseus, his palace, his diagnosis, his sea people's crew, or one cause for the collapse. The victors may have belonged to the same broad age of violence and mobility that weakened the world they expected to return to. Some Aegean people may have joined groups later gathered under the Sea People's label. Those are careful possibilities, not hidden identities. What collapsed was not every life around the sea. Several palace, imperial, urban and exchange systems failed or changed unevenly. Communities continued. Skills moved. Stories endured. Oral poets transformed memory, and later writers and readers carried the poem onward. The quiet answer is that Nolan found a real historical pressure point, but not a recovered biography. Behind his Odyssey lies a world that truly changed. Between that world and the film stands Homer, preserving, altering, and imagining the long human desire to find a way home. The history is not weakened by leaving the hero unproven. It becomes clearer. Real places, institutions, objects, and later memories no longer have to perform the impossible task of certifying every scene. They can show us instead how different ages used the past, and how a question from a modern film can lead back toward evidence without asking evidence to become myth. And now the names may drift again. Troy, Ithaca, Pylos, Egypt, Zeus, Athena, Odysseus. The distinctions can remain even as the details soften. Film, poem, and history, three lights held apart along the same dark water.